Hey there, everyone. Today I'd like to look at what Foucault has to say about the relation between the subject and knowledge in his lectures that he delivered to the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro in 1973, which you can find in this really lovely collection of his essential works on power, published by Penguin. And this is really interesting. I just want to look at the first of 5 lectures which he gave at this university, in which he looks at the development of the subject in a really interesting way. I think Foucault is an interesting figure because he's both a historian and a philosopher, and he's trying to uncover the contingent history of things that we take to be sacrosanct, eternal. He says it would be interesting to try to see how a subject came to be constituted that is not definitively given, that is not the thing on the basis of which truth happens to history. Rather, a subject that constitutes itself within history and is constantly established and re-established by history. It is toward that radical critique of the human subject by history that we should direct our efforts. So instead of understanding the human subject as a privileged point in history, which is actually moving forward history through its agency, as you would see in Hegel, instead there is a reversal, where history is a collection of contingent points, not necessarily rational in its development, whereas it is for Hegel, because history is guided by reason for Hegel. Instead, for Foucault, history is power. It is brought forth by power, and it is a series of techniques. He says, in my view, what we should do is show the historical construction of a subject through a discourse understood as consisting of a set of strategies which are part of social practices. So in a very similar way to, for example, how Max Weber is talking about the development of the Protestant work ethic as a collection of religious discourses interacting with one another and intersecting with the economic needs of the Puritans and the Quakers and the Methodists and the Calvinists coming over to the 13 colonies. In the same way, Foucault is trying to figure out how these discursive and contingent practices lead to the ways in which we actually structure our lives as people in the modern world. Now, Foucault states that what he finds interesting about Nietzsche, and the reason that he is going to focus on Nietzsche in this first lecture, is because Nietzsche is effectively not granting the pre-existence of the subject. He's trying to understand how is he contingently developed, because, for example, Nietzsche will often talk about the last man in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, this sort of lifeless subject who feels as if he is completed history, and thus we reach a sort of nihilistic end to history where we have a state of deceit and arrogance and permanent self-pity, which Nietzsche's not privy to. But he's talking about the development of not only the subject, but of course of morality in his genealogy of morals. And Foucault wants to quote a section of Nietzsche that he finds particularly interesting, which you can find on Truth and Lies in a moral sense, or in a non-moral sense, where Nietzsche says, in some remote corner of the universe, bathed in the fires of innumerable solar system, there once was a planet where clever animals invented knowledge. That was the grandest and most mendacious minute of universal history, quote unquote. And what Foucault finds so interesting about this is the notion of invention, Erfindung in German. And Foucault makes a differentiation between invention, Erfindung, and origin, or Ursprung in German. And an Ursprung is a sort of creation ex nihilo. This is like the origin of the universe is its creation by God. Whereas the invention of the universe, Erfindung, would be, for Foucault, the development of the concept of universe as something invented which meets certain, for example, scientific needs to understand what's the difference between the universe and a galaxy and a planet and a moon, for example, all these different things that kind of work together. And Foucault says religion has no origin. It has no Ursprung. It was invented. There was an Erfindung of religion. At a particular moment in the past, something happened that made religion appear. Religion was made. It did not exist before. And this is an important distinction to be made if you want to really understand Foucault's work, is he is deeply concerned with history not as this stable continuum, but essentially a series of discontinuities, of junctures in which things become true. It's similar to how William James says that truth happens to a thing, where when it becomes advantageous for Foucault for a particular set of powers, a truth will actually enter on the scene. And this does not mean that, for example, the universe came into existence when we came up with the word universe or the concept universe. No, what this means is that there is no Ding an sich for Foucault. There is no thing in itself outside of our discursive being tied up with that thing. There is this mutual interplay between the things that we presuppose outside of our knowledge that are the precondition for our knowledge, and also the ways in which our knowledge relegates that thing to a specific category and thus constitutively changes it. So when he says that, for example, religion was made, it did not exist before, he's not saying that, for example, the experiences or things that the experiences are referring to didn't exist before we created this constitutive system of religion. What he's saying, rather, is that all of these different experiences and whatnot constitute individual elements or moments that, with a certain agency or certain momentous occasion, will actually become formalized into a system. And for Foucault, he wants to understand formal knowledge, because Foucault understands that knowledge will naturally situate itself into systems which have formal, logical relations to one another. Heidegger basically says the same thing when he differentiates between the primary sort of knowledge we have, which is know-how. It's, I know how to walk through a door, and I don't know it in any kind of formal sense. If someone asked me, how do you open a door? Well, I probably have never had to formulate this belief or think about it in an intentionalistic or representationalist way at all. I just knew it implicitly in a non-formal sense, in a sort of undifferentiated way in which it fits into my practices. So this know-how is something that was never really invented in a formal way at all. But when someone asks me or prompts me with a question or a problematic, as Deleuze would put it, this prompts the need to formally create knowledge as such, rather than just this undifferentiated habit which doesn't have a formal status at all. So when Foucault is talking about Erfindung, about the invention of the subject, he's trying to show how what we view as, for example, human or man or normal, these things which are laden with a lot of assumptions, how these things are the collection of a number of disparate elements. He says the ideal has no origin. It too was invented, manufactured, produced by a series of mechanisms, of little mechanisms. And that's an important thing of connecting Foucault's work to Deleuze's work, is Deleuze and Guattari are talking about microfascisms, they're talking about micropolitics, they're talking about the ways in which, for example, the state is in many ways an abstraction, that when we actually look into the micropolitics of the state, we see a lot of little tiny mechanisms working together to give us this abstraction that we call the state, that we think we're referring to something concrete with, but it's actually something rather abstract and potentially hindering our analyses. In the same way, when Foucault talks about power, you might be tempted when you see power to just be like, oh, he's just talking about it in this abstract way. But no, Foucault does these very detailed contingent historical studies of the ways in which different sort of power paradigms form, in which different ways of effectuating change occur on the back of power through specific institutions. The ways in which general forms of imposition of norms, for example, get instantiated in different institutions. And for him, Erfindung, or invention, is a sort of break, or what he will later call discontinuity. He says this is the crucial point of the Erfindung. It was by obscure power relations that poetry was invented. It was also by pure and obscure power relations that religion was invented. We see the meanness, then, of all these small beginnings as compared with the solemnity of their origin as conceived by philosophers. The historian should not be afraid of the meanness of things, for it was out of the sequence of mean and little things that finally great things were formed. Good historical method requires us to counterpose the meticulous and unavowable meanness of these fabrications and inventions to the solemnity of origins. So what he's saying here is that philosophers like to try to use these sort of abstractions, like, for example, the state or power as such, or, these things that have essences which could potentially have a capital letter in front of them. But Foucault says no. In fact, often if we look at the origin of these things, we'll see, for example, just little laws passed here and there, or new changes in the way in which we organize societies, little things that accumulate over time in a sort of evolutionary sense to yield, these are small adaptations resulting in an apparent speciation event, whereas in reality there was this gradual continuum with lots of tiny discontinuities instead of huge major historical breaks. Hegel wants to talk about world historical persons. I don't remember exactly. I imagine it's a Weltgeschichte Person or something like that. These people like Napoleon, for example, who are just creating this monumentous gravitational effect in history. Foucault's like, no, most of history is not occurring like that. It's very tiny moments. He says knowledge was invented then. To say that it was invented is to say it has no origin, Ursprung. More precisely, it is to say, however paradoxically this may be, that knowledge is absolutely not inscribed in human nature. This is one of the things that's important for understanding the Chomsky-Foucault debate, because Foucault is very skeptical of human nature, because he thinks it's making an essence out of something historically contingent. Knowledge doesn't constitute man's oldest instinct, and conversely, in human behavior, the human appetite, the human instinct, there is no such thing as the seed of knowledge. I think of, for example, there's a passage in Plato's Republic where he says, what is entirely knowable, and what in no way is in every way unknowable. Foucault totally doubts that assurance of knowledge, the assurance that we have some a priori promise to be able to know things. Foucault says, in fact, this is not some essence we have, but it's the accumulation of history. As a matter of fact, Nietzsche says knowledge does have a connection with the instincts, but it cannot be present in them, and cannot even be one instinct among the others. Knowledge is simply the outcome of the interplay, the encounter, the junction, the struggle, and the compromise between the instincts. Something is produced because the instincts meet, fight one another, and at the end of their battles, finally reach a compromise. That something is knowledge. And the way that Foucault is talking about knowledge here is very similar to the way that Hobbes talks about rights. Now, Hobbes claims that natural rights are something we can deduce from reason, that they always existed, but that we needed to, use our reason to find them. But really, when you look at the way social contract theory works in Hobbes, rights basically come into being at the moment where they are established via the law, which Hobbes calls, quite ominously, an overarching coercive authority. that the law is here to ensure that we can actually have the existence of rights in the first place, because rights are contracts, and the state will ensure that as this overarching coercive authority, that if you disobey these laws, you will be punished. So in a similar way, this is exactly how Foucault sees power and the knowledge which results from it. It is an accumulation of encounters, of struggles, which is very similar to how Hobbes talks about the state of nature. That without the state, without rights, life would be nasty, brutish, and short, right? So Foucault says that knowledge is like a luminescence, a spreading light, but one that is produced by mechanisms of realities that are completely different natures. Knowledge is a result of the instincts. It is like a stroke of luck, or like the outcome of a protracted compromise. It is also, Nietzsche says, like a spark between two swords, but not a thing made of their metal. Foucault calls knowledge a surface effect. You can think of it as an emergent property, as one of the more ubiquitous terms in modern analytic philosophy. That this is resultant from certain causes, yet is ontologically distinct from those causes. Foucault says, I will cite just one passage from The Gay Science, Aphorism 109. The total character of the world is chaos for all eternity, in the sense not of a lack of necessity, but of a lack of order, arrangement, form, beauty, wisdom. Foucault writes, the world absolutely does not seek to imitate man. It knows no law. And when he's saying law here, he does not mean that the universe knows no regularities. He means it does not have laws in this essentialist sense of a formal law that is obeyed. Let us guard against saying that there are laws in nature. Knowledge must struggle against a world without order. In other words, without the promise of a priori order. This does not mean that we cannot induce order. In fact, we can. Hume says just as much, that even though we can't a priori prove there is causality, we just induce it, nevertheless, we do witness it in experience. He says, knowledge must struggle against a world without order, without connectedness, without form, without beauty, without wisdom, without harmony, and without law. Again, these are all without the a priori capital letter sense of them. That is the world that knowledge deals with. There is nothing in knowledge that enables it by any right whatever to know this world. That's important. By the same stroke in reference to Plato, there is nothing within the human that promises that what is knowable to us. It is not natural for nature to be known. And this is important. Think of knowledge in the formal sense of when I ask you how do you open a door and you give me a checklist of this is how you open the door. That is formal knowledge, as Heidegger calls it. John Dewey calls it logical knowledge. And then as opposed to these kinds of knowledge, there's habits, right? These undifferentiated ways of tarrying with the world, which merely map themselves into a contingent continuum. These sorts of knowledge are not natural. In fact, as Heidegger mentions, most of the ways that we live our lives, even as modern individuals immersed in modern society, we don't have most of our knowledge in the form of knowledge at all. We just do. It is not, for example, the case that I know how to open the door. I just open the door. And when someone asks me how I know, that prompts the creation of knowledge. And that is very important for Foucault, because that asking of the question, the instantiation of the problematic, is itself that which creates its own preconditions of what it's supposedly trying to explain. He says, thus, between the instincts and knowledge, one finds not a continuity, but rather a relation of struggle, domination, servitude, and settlement. In the same way, there can be no relation of natural continuity between knowledge and the things that knowledge must know. In other words, there is no a priori guarantee that the things of knowledge are the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. There can only be a relation of violence, domination, power, and force, a relation of violation, and hence his interest in the Marquis de Sade, for example. Knowledge can only be a violation of the things to be known and not a perception, a recognition, an identification of or with those things. In other words, knowledge is not a representation of the world outside of our knowledge. Knowledge is a system which forms its own discursive relations, which is, for a matter of fact, indifferent to how things actually are in themselves, an sich. Instead, they are concerned about making their effects known, and in particular, making certain people's needs be obeyed by society. You'll see this, for example, in Adeimantus or Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, who mentioned that justice is basically the benefit of the stronger, and that a social contract will be created, as Hobbes would say, in order to make certain people's goods be respected by the entirety of society, such that everyone else has to take the negative social costs that one normally would. Foucault quotes Nietzsche once again here from the Genealogy of Morals, who says, "Henceforth, dear philosophers, let us be on guard against the snares of such contradictory concepts as pure reason, absolute spirit, knowledge an sich in itself." And Foucault writes that Nietzsche means that there is not a nature of knowledge, an essence of knowledge, of the universal conditions of knowledge as such. Rather, that knowledge is always the historical and circumstantial result of conditions outside the domain of knowledge. In other words, we have all sorts of political and indeed, as Marx would say, economic forces, and indeed Foucault wants to point to just social forces in general that are creating our knowledge, such that knowledge is not just this innocent affair between truth and our deep, innate human essence of being truth seekers, of having the ability to gain knowledge and truth as such. Instead, this attempt to reach knowledge and indeed to come to claims to knowledge is not just a knowledge affair. It is, as Foucault will later say in, I think, the 5th lecture, that it is an interpolitical affair. He says, in reality, knowledge is an event that falls under the category of activity. Knowledge is not a faculty or a universal structure. Even when it uses a certain number of elements that may pass for universals, knowledge will only belong to the order of results, events, effects. So once again, this is a form of strategy. And Foucault has some really good stuff to say on the perspectivalism of Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche is famous for being one of the kind of founders of perspectival literature and philosophy, where we have the juxtaposition of different perspectives, and none of them are necessarily privileged. They're not put in hierarchical order, where some perspectives are more indicative or going to induce truth more than others. This is the kind of thing you'll have in classic literature where you have an omniscient narrator who narrates above what's going on in the story and can promise to give you a true recollection of events. But with perspectival literature, such as James Joyce, Thomas Pynchon, you will find that the perspective of the omniscient narrator disappears. You'll even see this in the Marquis de Sade, where there is no privileging of perspectives, but merely the contestation of perspectives, which is exactly what Foucault sees power as doing. It is this contestation of struggling agencies seeking to have their agency recognized formally qua knowledge. So when Nietzsche speaks of the perspectival character of knowledge, he's pointing to the fact that there is knowledge only in the form of a certain number of actions that are different from one another and multifarious in their essence. Actions by which the human being violently takes hold of a certain number of things, reacts in a certain number of situations, and subjects them to relations of force. And that force, that is the contestation that he was speaking of, that is not seeking to resolve, but actually to put things into violent discontinuity with one another. This means that knowledge is always a certain strategic relation in which man is placed. This strategic relation is what will define the effect of knowledge. That's why it would be completely contradictory to imagine a knowledge that was not by nature partial, oblique, and perspectival. The perspectival character of knowledge derives not from human nature, but always from the polemical and strategic character of knowledge. In other words, the only reason we can have perspectives is because of the fact that there is no essence of knowledge as such, that knowledge must necessarily reach out of the formal domain of knowledge pure and simple and understanding truth, and it must reach into the political, into the social, into the cultural, into the gendered, into, all these other things in order to amass what is called knowledge. One can speak of the perspectival character of knowledge because there is a battle, and knowledge is the result of this battle. And we might add, not the foundation of this battle. Knowledge, he says, simplifies, passes over differences, lumps things together without any justification in regard to truth. Because, right, this is a pragmatic concern with the usefulness or the payoff of what a belief is going to give. As William James says, truth has a cash value. Truth pays. It follows that knowledge is always a misconstruction, méconnaissance. Moreover, it is always something that is aimed maliciously, insidiously, and aggressively at individuals, things, situations. There is knowledge only insofar as something like a single combat, a tete-a-tete, a duel is set up, contrived between man and what he knows. There is always something in knowledge that is analogous to the duel and accounts for the fact that it is always singular. That is the contradictory character of knowledge as it is defined in the Nietzsche text that seems to contradict one another. It is both generalizing and yet always singular. So, right, we're trying to traditionally come to knowledge of the truth, some singular thing, and yet it requires this disparate domain of a multiplicity of facts and requires generalizing all these into a framework which is then ad hoc claimed to be a priori. He does the same thing when he's talking about gender, and Judith Butler mentions as such in Gender Trouble. Therefore, Foucault concludes, the political and economic conditions of existence are not a veil or an obstacle for the subject of knowledge, but the means by which the subject of knowledge is formed, and hence are true relations. There cannot be particular types of subjects of knowledge, orders of truth, or domination or domains of knowledge, except on the basis of political conditions that are the very ground on which the subject, the domains of knowledge, and the relations of truth are formed. We might once again say invented, erfunden. Only by shedding these grand themes of the subject of knowledge, imputed to be at once originary and absolute, we might think of Descartes' cogito, for example, and perhaps by using the Nietzschean model, will we be able to do a history of truth. In other words, the subject is secondary to knowledge forces that create it. So that being said, I hope this has been helpful in understanding some of what Foucault has to say about the relation between knowledge and power. I find him a very interesting philosopher. I know a lot of people dislike him. I really don't care. I think he's cool, and I think he has some good ways of thinking about, media studies today or things like that. So check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you just want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and as a cheap college student, I would appreciate any of the help, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.